Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, thanks for coming out tonight. I'm John Klaus. I'm chair of the program committee. And our program tonight will be presented by David Swenson, a research scientist for the ISU, Iowa State University Department of Economics. And we will be talking about social justice. This is a nation of the people, by the people, and for the people. But one of the hardest things we have is trying to allow our government to do something for the people. We're going to talk about what our government does for the people and how precarious the services to the public are when political winds begin to change. So, that said, take it away, Dave.
Okay, thank you. I'm glad to be here. For you folks who don't know much about me, as he said, I'm a research scientist in the Department of Economics. The kind of research and outreach that I do is called community and regional economics. And unlike a lot of the professors at Iowa State University, my field of study is actually our communities. My field of service is our communities. I work with state agencies. I work with organizations. I try to do analysis and evaluation to help people understand what's going on. Most of the work that I've been doing over the years has been with communities and community organizations, but I also teach, and I teach in community and regional planning. I have taught over the years in community and regional planning here at Iowa State, as well as for about 20 years at the University of Iowa School of Urban and Regional Planning. The teaching that I did involved helping people understand how to use economic principles, basic economic techniques to solve real-life problems. Mostly it's the kind of things that you would teach planners, not necessarily advanced students in economics, but it's the kinds of tools that you try to help planners understand. And along the way of teaching those tools, you have a lot of examples about what society has done on a communal basis, on a governmental basis, on a state level basis, or on a national basis to address the needs of society. So what we're talking about here today is how precarious is the social safety net when political winds change. And the point of this is that the things that we count and care for as our safety net is always tenuous. Sometimes it expands, sometimes it contracts, sometimes it disappears. So the way I want to do this today, and I hope it flows okay, I'm going to have a little bit of stuff about public sector economics, just a little bit here. And it's not hard and there's no formulas, okay? So it's really basic. The next thing I want to do, though, is I want to talk about what instigates the need or the or attention being given to society's needs. And those are great events, and we're going to talk about that. And then I'm going to start with a litany over time of how have we built the safety net here in the United States. And as I talk about how we have built that safety net, you're also going to see, if you've been around long enough, you're going to remember, or if you just think a little bit about current events, you're going to remember or recognize that most of what I'm going to be describing and explaining are things that have been contentious, under attack, sometimes dismissed, sometimes they're resurrected, and how we go. And then the last thing I want to do is I want to focus on two examples, and they apply specifically to what's going on in Iowa. And those two examples have to do with labor. How do we treat labor? I'm not talking about labor unions. I'm talking about how do we treat labor, people who work, and how are our attitudes forming here in the state of Iowa. So that's what's going on right now. So to preface this, I'm going to start by being an economist. An economist is going to say we have a market society, and we trust that market to allocate goods and services, and we try to let the market do most of the things that the market is supposed to do. But we have this problem with our markets. Our markets fail sometimes. And because our markets fail, it's incumbent on us as a collective unit in governments at the federal level, state level, less so at the local level. It's incumbent on us to address those market failures. And in a minute, I'll talk about what those market failures are. The problem is that we try to deal with what is feasible at the time. We have a market failure, and we try to come up with a feasible response to that market failure. Someplace the market isn't working and it isn't taking care of the needs of citizens. And so the government is empowered or obliged to address that. But what's feasible becomes subjective at times. Sometimes it's limited by the fiscal restraints, how much money we have. We know that it's going to be limited by politics in and of itself because people have different attitudes as to whether something is or is not important. And we have other kinds of constraints, and they are social constraints. They're a willingness, our collective ability to even define something as a problem over time. So no matter what, this country, usually driven by crises, has developed a safety net. And that safety net is composed of many things, and I'm going to describe what I think that safety net is primarily composed of as I move along here. It's designed to care for vulnerable populations, to preserve natural resources, and to address critical instances of unmet need. Still, and this is important, elections matter. And the value of specific social support ebbs and flows over time, depending on who's in power and how they exercise that power. And it's true at the federal level, and we're seeing here right now in the Midwest, here in Iowa, that's also true at the state level. And it's something that we're paying. So our social support systems are vulnerable to the political winds. We know that. We've watched this over time. And how vulnerable are they? You can name, all of you can probably name things that you care about that are under attack or have been undermined, if not currently, at least over time. And that means who the social safety net catches and misses also changes over time. So that's where I want to go with this, and we're going to see where I end up. And the first thing I'm going to do is turn this on and advance the thing. So first of all, I'm going to talk about market failures. And this is the economics part of this. And when we talk about market failures, we're also implicitly talking about what is the justification for government intervening in the markets and in society. And the first example of market failures is easy. It's monopolies. You know, the breakup of the great oil trusts back in the early part of the 1900s, the breakup of AT&T, you remember that? We probably should be breaking up Microsoft, those types of things. Those are the kinds of things that government has to deal with because monopolies in and of themselves are a market failure, and they're not allocating all of those goods and services that should be provided in the most efficient way. We also have oligopolies, where you have a few powerful things. You can think of maybe some of the key tech companies in the United States all being oligopolies, that they have a little bit of a specialty, but they limit entry into competition. Those might be. You might think in terms of the meatpacking industry right now as it exists in the United States, both on the beef and the pork and as well as on the poultry side. That maybe those are oligopolies, and they're things that we need to address. The other one is incomplete markets, and this is just really easy. We have to have insurance. We have the FDIC to safeguard our banks that had to evolve over time. Crop insurance to maintain and the stability and sustainability of the agricultural system. I'm talking about financial sustainability, not necessarily environmental sustainability, and the need for Medicare and Medicaid. So we have incomplete markets. We have information failures. The Federal Trade Commission, the Food and Drug Administration, to make sure that what we buy is what we're supposed to be buying, that it's safe. Okay, and so we have those kinds of things. We have the big things in terms of market failures, and of course, that's unemployment, high inflation, or just a basic dysfunctioning economy for one reason or another. We usually key into unemployment as being the big indicator of a market failure. The market is just simply not, well, actually what the market is doing during a business cycle and there's high unemployment, that basically the market is trying to correct itself. But because the market is trying to correct itself, it creates a lot of social damage. And over the course of creating that social damage, when the market is trying to correct itself, it harms workers, it harms households, it harms communities, and it harms governments. And so we have an obligation to deal with that. But the things that are in red on that chart are the things that are called, that we most often ask our governments to deal with. The first part is just simply public goods. And those are just the basic things that we oftentimes take for granted. National defense, it could be a lighthouse on the shore of the ocean. It could be something that the government provides that the private sector just simply will not provide, cannot provide, or will not provide enough of for society. In one way or the other, the private sector would exclude the provision of these services to certain groups of people. So that's a basic, pure public good. But the other category is called a merit good. And a merit good is composed of things that we ought to be doing as part of a civilized, organized society. And those merit goods are the things that over time we've said that it's good to do, like public education, like vaccinations, things like that. Other kinds of prohibitions that we might have adopted over time that we think are in keeping and so, seatbelts, things like that. Merit goods, things that we should be providing and or regulating in one form or the other. And then the last one on that list has to do with externalities. Externalities in economics is basically, at the most basic level, it just says that what I'm doing imposes costs on other people that are not reflected in the prices that I charge. Okay? So if I'm polluting and I'm making other people sick, that's not being reflected in the prices that I charge for my goods and for the goods that I'm selling. The same thing with air and water pollution, land pollution, any kind of pollution. But there are other kinds of externalities that we have to deal with. So public goods and externalities are where we see most of the regulation that is involved with regard to society and the creation of a safety net in society. That's the primary justification for some of those actions on the part of government. Now, historically, our safety net is not something that somebody woke up one day and said, you know, we really need to do this. It's been driven by great events. And I'm only going back 100 years or so, not quite 100 years. But the biggest modern times event that developed the modern safety net that we know, big portions of it, was the Great Depression. Now, I think a lot of people don't have a really good handle on, I wasn't around at that time, but I do read. And the Great Depression, we were well into the Great Depression before we had any kind of meaningful programs that started to turn things around. We were 3 and 4 years into it. It was during the Hoover administration. During the duration of most of the Hoover administration, the economy was in recession, going into depression, unemployment was rising, things continued to get worse no matter what was done. And then, in 1933, remember this is starting in 1929, and in 1933, March of 1933, Roosevelt, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, takes office. He has to deal initially with some stabilizing things. We have the Civilian Conservation Corps. He's got to get some people to work. He's got to stabilize the banking system. He has to do a lot of the emergency early measures in what we might call the first New Deal. But there's the second New Deal, and we're going to deal with that in just a second. We have the Civil Rights Movement of the 50s and the 60s. Rights and obligations that were accumulating over that period of time, from the 1940s into the 50s, had to be implemented and safeguarded mostly during the 1960s. We had urban civil unrest during the 1960s into the early 1970s. A lot of that had to do with a denial of opportunity, with living conditions in urban areas for a lot of reasons. Again, we had to deal with those. Environmental degradation that came to a head by the late 1960s. When we get in 1970 our first Earth Day, we also get some legislation that evolved from that. In more modern times, just not that long ago, the Great Recession, and all that had to evolve and emerge from that. And then finally, we have this COVID-19 pandemic and how we're dealing with this. So this isn't everything, but it's the big things that I'm thinking of. I've specifically excluded wars and other kinds of events, and we can talk about that perhaps at another time. So what did we get? What did we get first with the Great Depression, with the New Deal? We got the Social Security Act. And look at that first set of things that we got. We got old age and survivors insurance. We got unemployment insurance. We got welfare assistance for the disabled, for single mothers, and for children. To this day, there are still arguments, controversies as to the level to which we ought to be funding these things. All of these are things that we still wrestle with to this day. It wasn't just during the George W. Bush administration. He was going to reform Social Security. He was going to privatize it. Remember that. Take it out of the public sphere. The National Labor Relations Act, also known as the Wagner Act, that basically created the foundation for the modern labor movement, allowed and facilitated and protected the process of organizing for collective bargaining. The Works Projects Administration, basically it was a put people to work broadly, creating necessary infrastructure. We benefit widely and broadly from all of the things that were done at that time in terms of public buildings and roads and parks, a wide range of things, to include employment programs that made sure that minorities were employed, youth were employed, artists were employed, writers were employed. It was a broad-based system of support for the United States. And then the Early Housing Act. And again, that was to provide mostly low-income, or housing for low-income people. So that's during the Great Depression, and that was my first one. The next example that I have, and I'm coming quite a ways forward, is the Great Society programs under President Lyndon Johnson. The Great Society programs were a big part of what Johnson wanted to implement, and then our involvement in Vietnam somewhat detracted from his ability to fully follow through and fully fund a lot of what was intended at the beginning. But it started out with the War on Poverty. And the War on Poverty, we had the Economic Opportunity Act. It created community action programs. And it created community action offices in not just urban areas in the United States, but rural areas as well. Southern, in the Black Belt of the southern part of the United States, on the Cheyenne River Indian Reservation where I grew up, my mom's first job outside of the house was working for a community action agency as a secretary back in 1965. They created incentives for state and local governments to try to help people become employed. It funded training programs. We had loan guarantees for businesses. Okay, Medicare and Medicaid are created at that time. Does anybody out there know who the first Medicare card was issued to?
My grandpa.
Harry S. Truman. That was, anyway, that's just a piece of trivia. Head Start. Head Start started out, it was supposed to be a summer camp program for 3- and 4-year-old disadvantaged children. Ultimately, it became a program, a preschool program for low-income people, spread widely throughout the United States, studied broadly by academics. Basically, the conclusion is Head Start was one heck of a great program. The government becomes much more involved in primary and secondary education over this period of time, providing funds for people who are disabled, funds to deal with special categories that are much more of federal interest in terms of underwriting education and or opportunity at the local levels. We have the Housing and Urban Development Act. The whole idea was to try to stimulate more renovation in our urban areas, more housing, especially for low income. We had to renovate our urban areas because the urban areas had been decimated because of rapid suburbanization, white flight, disinvestment, all of those types of things. National Endowment for the Arts and the Humanities. Our safety net also includes cultural categories as well. They're not just bread and butter issues in housing, but also those as well. And then finally I put up there the Appalachian Regional Commission. And the Appalachian Regional Commission was, it's a federally sanctioned organization that's supposed to be a private-public partnership, but it acknowledges that there was a huge spatial swath of the United States that was disadvantaged disproportionately to the rest of the country, and that it needed a wide range of assistance and services and planning and programming to try to get people out of Appalachian rural poverty and into the workforce, and basically to improve their economies. I'm throwing up environmental protection because the Environmental Protection Act created a huge change in the United States, how business was done, but also portended a huge change in the wellness of people. And we have, straight off the bat, the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act. Both of them passed in 1970. Both of them much more important in urban areas and in manufacturing centers, and instrumental in cleaning up our nation's waterways as well as our air, removing lead from gasoline, all kinds of things designed to improve quality of life and health and welfare at the time. And then the Endangered Species Act, I always throw that in there as well, because not only are arts and the culture important to quality of life, so is maintaining our environment from the standpoint of our natural resources and our flora and fauna. Workplace safety. At the same time, roughly at the same time, we get the Occupational Safety and Health Act. We're not just now talking about broad-based assistance to those in need. We're also talking about renovating and modernizing the workforce to prevent people from being exposed to chemicals, prevent people from being exposed to dangerous working conditions, to establish series of standards with regard to workplace safeties, whether it's wearing helmets or goggles or face masks like you all are wearing right now, all of those things, and monitoring and making sure that working didn't kill you, or at least killed fewer of us over that period of time. Created the National Institutes of Science and Health to study these kinds of issues. It is one of those categories, though, because it encompassed so much of the economy that it bogged down the regulation and rulemaking processes, bogged down because there are so many chemicals and so many processes and so many things to be regulated, that it's one of those categories that provided an initial set of safety for workers, but it's continuously evolving and then regressing over time, and basically depending on which administration is pushing for workplace safety or not. Now, everything that I've talked about is something that you can remember over several administrations. They've either re-emphasized or de-emphasized. And so you can see that there's always been an ebb and flow with regard to all of these categories. And these are some of the other things that have happened in terms of establishing the safety net. We have the Food Stamp Act that we really see that in the early 1970s. Women, infants, and children, anybody who knows how important that program is to provide education, nutritional, education, nutritional, and health assistance to pregnant or nursing mothers and or children. Okay, hugely important in terms of improving the health and well-being of young mothers especially, as well as with the outcomes of their birth. State and local fiscal assistance, what we used to call general revenue sharing. I remember writing one of the first papers I wrote for one of my research outfits that I worked. It was on general revenue sharing. President Reagan said general revenue sharing in 1985, during the reauthorization of general revenue sharing, he said there was never a dollar of federal money better spent. 3 years later, they eliminated that program. But that was the transfer of federal money to local governments to basically say, local governments know more about what their needs are. We're going to transfer this money to state and local governments. Later on, it was just local governments and not states. And they had this bundle of money that they could count on to do whatever they needed to do for their citizens. Americans with Disabilities Act. That was probably one of the biggest ones in recent years, and that's been well over 30 years now. My former wife was a counselor with regard to the ADA and helped work with people in terms of what they had to do to implement it and thing. At that time, there was tremendous pushback against the ADA. Even though it was reasonably well supported in Congress, it was not well supported out among commerce and in local governments. There was a lot of pushback, and there still is pushback on the ADA. Affordable Care Act with Obama, of course, we all we remember that. And then I throw in there the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau that was created during the Great Recession because so many borrowers in the United States, so many people are basically ripped off financially because of their inability to navigate some of the financial systems in the United States. Currently, we have pandemic relief that we're living through. We have child tax credits that while they were there, we found out that it lowered child poverty by 40%. They have now eliminated it. The stories in the paper today and yesterday were, guess what? Child poverty has increased by 40%. Now, they're going to be able to access that money via their tax returns on a lump sum basis, the rest that is due to them. But the point of it was, while it was distributed out on a monthly basis, that was really beneficial to families with children. And then, of course, we have Build Back Better, which is stalled right now, is probably going to be reassembled in some form or another. And what sounded like it was going to be a great and important expansion in the nation's safety net has sort of fizzled. And we're going to have to wait and see what happens there. So those are the big categories as we've moved through time. And every one of these things I've talked about in one form or another has been, again, emphasized, de-emphasized, reformed in one form or another. I forgot to talk about one up there, and that was welfare reform under Clinton. President Clinton was going to reform welfare as we knew it. And what he did with the safety net and with regard to welfare reform is he put really rigid, harsh boundaries around receiving welfare assistance, what we used to call aid for families with dependent children. They renamed the temporary assistance to needy families. It set a hard limit on how long you could, lifetime limit on how long you could receive those benefits. It required you to get training. It expected those mothers with children primarily that they were to then rotate off of public assistance and into the workforce. And for the most part, it did not change the level of poverty among that population because they rotated out of public assistance into working at McDonald's and other kinds of, more often than not, low-wage jobs. And so we got a cheap labor supply out of it. We discounted the value of being a mother and raising children over the course of it, and we put some really hard edges on welfare reform. Okay, I've got two topics that I want to talk about here. Minimum wage and unemployment in Iowa, and how we're addressing it in Iowa and to a certain degree nationwide. Now, minimum wage, you might think, is really not all that important right now because in this pandemic we've seen wages get bid up significantly, and that is true. We're in the current situation that we're in. We're seeing robust bids for wages. My McDonald's up the road over here is offering jobs for $15 an hour. People have been screaming $15 minimum wage for a long time. The market is up there. But I'm interested in the minimum wage much more from a policy perspective as opposed to a practical perspective. The Minimum Wage Act was in 1938, set the minimum wage at 25 cents an hour. It has been adjusted periodically over time, as we do know. It's now $7.25 an hour. Minimum wage earners are a relatively small fraction of the economy and of society, and they certainly are not politically powerful. But there was a time in our history where we addressed the minimum wage somewhat aggressively, and I'm going to show you a graph here. This is the minimum wage from 1969 on. This is working. Federal minimum wage since 1969. And you can see, now this was a period of relatively high inflation, but you can see that there was a systematic increasing of the minimum wage from 1969, which is where I started this, all the way up through 1981. Now, what happens in 1981? Who becomes president? Reagan. Reagan becomes president. What happens? No adjustment in the minimum wage. Towards the end of his administration, there was an adjustment. We get George W. Bush. No adjustment. Long periods. Doesn't resemble this at all. We get an adjustment, flat period. We get another couple of adjustments at the end of George W. Bush. And then you can see since that adjustment that occurred in 2008, I believe, we have seen no increase in the federal minimum wage. This is simply politics. It's just simply indifference to the need to set a floor at which employers cannot pay less for the labor that they employ. And it's silly. It's silly because all through this time period, we have this thing called inflation. And all through this time period, we have buying power being eroded. So this is what's going on. So this is what this looks like. And this is the federal minimum wage in constant 2021 amounts. It's currently at $7.25 an hour. In today's dollars, well, 2021's dollars, the peak of the minimum wage in terms of buying power was $12.32 an hour in 1972 when I entered the job market. I didn't know how good it was when I was getting minimum wage at $2 an hour in 1972. Now you can see the effect of inflation on this over time, and you can then see also the effects of not adjusting that minimum wage, and then you have these spasms. The worst it's ever been in terms of real dollars, current dollars, is right here before they adjusted prior to Obama at $6.92. Now if you assume that maybe then this period right here reflects what the minimum wage ought to be, then that's somewhere around $11 an hour. That's what it maybe ought to be. And by my measure, all of the distance between this and what it actually is a form of social wage theft, an unwillingness to compensate people what they deserve, an extraction of labor out of people that's not properly compensated. So that's my opinion of that. And the fact that we haven't dealt with it really is, I think, shameful. Here's me. I got out of the Army in 1976, took a job working in a gas station. I got $2.30 an hour. In today's dollars, I should be paid $11 an hour. That's what I should be paid, pumping gas, except nobody pumps gas anymore, but I did. That's what I did. So where does that leave us? We have some other statistics on the minimum wage. Some people say the minimum wage needs to be low because it's good for business. It keeps us competitive, especially with our neighboring states, except our neighboring states all have minimum wages, for the most part, that are higher than ours. And I have asterisks by Illinois because in the greater Chicago area, they even have a higher minimum wage. The same thing with Minnesota. St. Paul and Minneapolis has a higher minimum wage. I have an asterisk by my home state of South Dakota because South Dakota, who would have ever thought of them as being progressive, has indexed their minimum wage to inflation. It just increases automatically. It's the only progressive thing I've ever seen out of South Dakota since George McGovern. Since George McGovern, that's it. My great friend and idol. And you can see the only other state that brackets that low minimum wage is Wisconsin. Wisconsin is low as well. If I were to and I don't have it here, but if I was going to put a graph up there of our growth of these states from 2011 to 2019, prior to the great pandemic, kicking our hind ends economically, I would see that Illinois, Missouri, Nebraska, South Dakota, and even Wisconsin all grew at about the same rate. Not much difference. Minnesota outgrew everybody. Iowa grew more slowly than all of them. The minimum wage wasn't the reason for that. It's other issues associated with our economy. Who earns the minimum wage in the United States? Well, in the United States it's about 1.9%. 60% are 25 and older. It's not just kids. 60%. They're 2 times more likely to be a woman. They tend to be lower educated. They tend to be stuck in or only can work part-time jobs. There are not huge racial differences, but there are huge spatial differences in the United States. If you go across the southern states, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and Florida, upwards of 4%, even higher, of their population is paid the minimum wage or less. It's less of an issue here, and again, it's not that many people, but the minimum wage is emblematic of an unwillingness to even attend to the value of work and how important that is to maintaining the nation's social safety net. Unemployment. This is what I really want to finish off with here today. Much of what we have in terms of a safety net in the United States are sets of counter-cyclical actions. When the economy does this, these kick in. When the economy turns down, when unemployment goes up, when people are out of work, we have things that kick in, like unemployment insurance. Or you eventually become able to access supplemental nutrition, the SNAP program, food stamps. Perhaps you're unemployed long enough and you're a single mom, you can maybe then move into temporary assistance for needy families. There's systems out there that take care of you. There are also job retraining and a whole variety of other types of things. There are a lot of people, and right off the bat, and I'll demonstrate this, there are a lot of people, though, that don't qualify for any kind of unemployment assistance. And we'll get to that here in just a second. So when I say unemployed, I want you to always assume that most people who are unemployed don't get any kind of unemployment assistance. Most people. That's true in Iowa, and that's true across the nation. Different states. Oh, and by the way, then we also have these other programs like SNAP, but child health care assistance in Iowa, it's called Hawkeye. Again, TANF, in Iowa, it's called the Family Investment Plan. They come up with some really great names. Different states have different mixtures of how these programs are administered and how people are made eligible for these programs. So that's the point. So let's just go through some maps here real quick. The first one is the fraction of unemployed receiving unemployment benefits. Iowa is right here. It's in the, is it this color? It's right here. We're pretty good. We're kind of in the middle, but it's close. It's come back alive. There we go. It's close to 40%. Close to 40% is the average. And this is what it was in March. Is it lower than that now? Okay, last month it was 30%. 2 months ago it was 18%. This was in March of 2020, just as we were crashing. This was their estimate of what the estimate was at that time. But you can see that many of the states, much lower percentages of their working population, their unemployed population, qualify for unemployment benefits. Okay, much lower. High in Minnesota, high in North Dakota, high in some of the New England and Mid-Atlantic states. Middle areas in the Midwest, low across the South. Okay, Iowa stands out among the somewhat more inclusive. We're not awful. This is the weekly benefit amount. Again, Iowa is right up here close to $500 for a single person. For a single person, I think. If you have dependents, it triggers and can go up, I think, to $630 or something like that. But you can see that we're in the middle. We have some states that are much higher, some states that are in the somewhat the middle, and some states that are really low. I will tell you this, if it ever happens to you, do not be unemployed in Arizona or Florida. Just don't do it, because it's not worth it. It's simply not worth it. Maximum number of weeks you can receive benefits. You can see that the norm by a large shot is a half a year. That the normal duration of maximum benefits is a half a year, 26 weeks. We have a few states, again, that are more stingy, and a few other states, depending on conditions and economic factors, have triggers that make it longer than 26 weeks. Okay? And so that's how the systems are operated in the United States. There was a presumption in some circles, though, that people would rather stay on unemployment than work. And this is something I have heard my whole life, the denigration of people who are unemployed. Anybody who was on unemployment was suspect. Anybody who was on unemployment was cheating the system. Anybody who was on unemployment was only showing up for their job interviews but not taking jobs, because being on unemployment was such a good way to live. Now, I have never been on unemployment, but I do know that as a single person, I would have a lot of trouble living the good life on about $490 a month. But maybe some people can. I don't know. With no health insurance, you can just run it. So let me show you what happened during, this is a graph that I used a lot during the Great Recession. What this is the number of unemployed people. Now remember, only a small fraction of these unemployed people are receiving benefits. And the bottom number is the number of job openings. Now, during the Great Recession, we get a few years into the Great Recession, and people start belly aching, and they're saying, the reason this economy isn't recovering faster is because we have these extended unemployment benefits. And they started cutting back and rolling back unemployment benefits with the idea that if you beat on people up here, somehow you're going to affect the number of jobs that are being opened over that period of time. And you can see that it didn't have any effect at all. These people, that slowly the economy recovered. Anything that they did on a policy basis didn't affect this green line. It didn't affect the number of job openings. It didn't affect the rate of recovery hardly at all. But, again, it became an article of faith among some people that are on unemployment are basically cheating government, cheating society, taking more than their share. And and so this was what was going on back at that time. So let's take our economy right now. This is our economy. We were growing. This is jobs in Iowa. We were growing. By March of 2013, we had recovered all of the jobs that we lost. We continued to grow. Yeah, not so hot here, not so hot here. And then we hit the pandemic recession, and we collapsed in terms of employment. Employment between February and April declined by 11% in Iowa. Harsh, sharp decline. But then it started to bounce back. Here's May, there's June, July, August. They called it a dead cat bounce, but it's a bounce nonetheless. Our economy is coming back on as we figure out during the pandemic that there are things that we can do, and slowly our economy is recovering. It's not back where it was prior to the pandemic. It's going to take a while for us to get there, but our economy is recovering. Now, the number of people who are unemployed, statistically unemployed in the state of Iowa, this is where it was in just a few years before the pandemic. It peaks at somewhere around 190,000 people were unemployed, when it was around 50,000 people before we went into that period. But you can see how sharply it dropped over that period of time. So this crisis wasn't long lasting. It lasted much of 2020, but it wasn't that long lasting. But you can see that as we moved into last year, into the middle of last year, March, April, May, June, the unemployment numbers went up again. And then they've slowly come down again. So this is the most recent number, so you can see what's going on here. Now, I just want to point out, back in 2016, middle of 2016, we had over 62,000 people unemployed. It declined down to close to 42,000, climbed back up to 52,000. You can see we had this kind of operating range of unemployed people in Iowa. It got down earlier on to about 60,000, where it was a few years ago, and everybody was just really happy with what unemployment was back then. Grew a little bit and came down. So what did we have? In June of 2021, the governor of Iowa, let me explain something here real quickly. When we had the pandemic, they implemented programs to provide unemployment assistance to people who normally wouldn't get unemployment. That included shopkeepers, gig workers, people who traditionally did not qualify for unemployment. Okay? It also passed a program that funded unemployment in Iowa for eligible workers longer than 26 weeks. So you had two things going on. We had extended unemployment assistance for long-term unemployed, and we had assistance to non-traditional people who were receiving unemployment assistance. Okay? In June of last year, the governor said she was going to eliminate those two federally funded programs because people were staying on unemployment and not going out and working and taking jobs. So that was the rationale. So in one swoop, they eliminated 25,000 people from benefits. There was about 24,000 maybe right off the bat, but then people who would have qualified for benefits over the next few months. Now those benefits were going to end in September, so she basically ended them sooner, with the idea that if I get these people off of the public dole, they are going to turn around and do what? They're going to take jobs. They're going to take jobs. So that's what the assumption was. We were going to get people off that generous public assistance that would compel job taking. How did it go? First of all, at this time, the majority of the unemployed weren't receiving benefits. Okay? They weren't receiving benefits. Between June and September, at least 25,000 were denied. So what we know is that there was a significant drop in household income among those who were denied benefits. So we know that their social safety net was jerked out from under them, and that their household spending went down, and that there had to have been stress within those households. But look at the job growth. Between July, by the time this is all fully implemented, and December, the last year that we have numbers here in Iowa, the U.S. economy expanded by 1.9%. Iowa's grew by 1.3%. Pretty anemic, pretty anemic. If it was just the month before, the U.S. economy at that measure had grown by 2% and Iowa had grown by 1%. So, excuse me. So there isn't any evidence that that growth was driven significantly by the people who had been denied assistance. They've doubled down, we have more stringent job search requirements that have been implemented. They have to make more contacts over the course of a week. They also have to make more, and they have to make more contacts with their case supervisor. Okay, right now, if you are unemployed, we have now a bill that is proposed eliminating the duration of unemployment from 26 weeks to 16 weeks. I showed you the map. 26 is broadly the norm. 16 is the exception. They want to move this into the exception category, and that is moving through as well. And in her condition of the state speech, the governor said, the government has taken away the need or desire to work. The safety net has become a hammock. And what I've got up there is I say this is all a great big swing and a miss because they're attacking the wrong thing. They're attacking the wrong thing. And here's what they missed, or at least what they're not talking about. What I've done here is I've indexed nationally, this is the labor force, I've indexed them to February of 2020. Here's the Iowa labor force, the national labor force, the blue is the Iowa labor force. We went into the recession. The US contracted much more sharply in terms of lost jobs than Iowa did, and then bounced back like Iowa did as well. But the US contracted much more sharply. However, look at this. The US's labor force bounced back and then has slowly been going. It hasn't been growing fast because people were knocked out of the labor force because of the COVID pandemic for a variety of reasons, but it has continued to improve. Iowa, even though employment had bounced back significantly, Iowa's labor force continued to contract until December of 2020 before it started to come back. So even though jobs are being restored in the economy, the people wanting to work in the economy have left, and the labor force has contracted. And this is atypical of what happened in the United States. This is our crisis. Our unemployment rate came down because people moved out of the labor force. They weren't in the numerator and they weren't in the denominator. And our unemployment rate went down, but that low unemployment rate doesn't do anything to help us understand why did we lose so much of our labor force. At one point, our labor supply had contracted by over 6%. It has now climbed back to where it's about 4% less than it was prior to the pandemic. What we don't know is why Iowa's labor force was hurt worse as a consequence of this pandemic than the national average. And that's the biggest issue going on right now in Iowa. And attacking unemployed people who are receiving benefits of one form or another has nothing to do with improving this problem here in Iowa. And so as far as I'm concerned, this is a huge, huge piece of policy potential that has been ignored or has not been understood by people in power here in the state of Iowa. And it needs to be addressed. I have gone on long, but I want to talk about this and why some of this is important. The minimum wage is important because there's been no state policy action on it in 15 years. For a variety of reasons, we see continuous attacks on our public assistance. Our senator out there will remember that someone was saying you had to get rid of your second car if you were going to qualify for food stamps here in Iowa. The idea that you actually had two beaters instead of one beater was considered disabling in terms of food stamps. When I was a college student many, many years ago, you actually did have to liquidate assets or demonstrate that you did not have assets to get food stamps. I had kids when I went to college. They require Medicaid recipients in Iowa, the poorest of the poor, oftentimes disabled, to come up with a copay. For crying out loud, you have no money, but by golly, they need to have some skin in the game, so you get your $10 out. Well, $10 if you don't have much money is a heck of a lot of money. Other states are attempting to pose work requirements. They've been thrown out in court, but you can see the attitudes and how people address basically the value of the safety net, the worth of the safety net. What we've learned during the pandemic is that there was great opportunity for the government, the federal government, oftentimes in participation and partnership with the states, to buffer the worst of the pandemic, help families. Yes, there was wasted money in the PPP program and some other categories, but the money that went mostly to households really did a lot of good for households, and really did. And we had expansion in food stamps. We had more coverage in terms of health care. We pushed the boundaries of the safety net all out as far as we could, and it had great benefits in society. And now we can see it's being pulled back in, and that's what we're living with right now in the current political environment in the states, in this state, as well as the national level. The impetus and the power to make many of those changes permanent has receded. And with regard to the safety nets, as I started, elections matter. Elections do matter. And I'm going to stop there and take either questions or if we can have some discussion. Sorry I went a little bit longer than I planned on, but I got a little bit gabby.
I was, as an economist, what do you consider to be the appropriate criteria for a fair minimum wage? And secondly, could you differentiate minimum wage from a living wage?
Oh, wow. Okay, well, first of all, minimum wage is a political construct. Okay, so I'm going to start right there. It's a political construct. At some point, some people get together, maybe informed by sociologists and economists, and decide what ought to be the appropriate pay for labor in a particular area. We know that the minimum wage in high-cost states should be higher, in low-cost states perhaps can be lower, and that's why we allow states to have differential minimum wages. But I don't know what the minimum wage ought to be, other than I told you that way back when we were paying a lot of attention to the minimum wage, it ought to be somewhere close to $11 an hour right now. So that's where it should be. A living wage, now it takes into account, we're looking at the characteristics of a household, a family. And what is it going to take for that household or family to be able to acquire the basics? Might we assume within that household a certain number of hours that it's possible for that household to work? If it's a one or a two-person, two-adult household, and it has one or two children, how much money is it going to take for them to be able to acquire the basics, to be able to afford the food, afford the rent, and have the means to just simply to exist without being in dire straits in our economy? So that's really what a living wage is supposed to be. And it's higher than the minimum wage because it assumes there are more adults within that household unit participating in the economy.
Thank you.
Yep.
Is there a way, when you have a minimum wage and you increase it, inflation increases also because it gets passed on and you're chasing your tail, aren't you?
No, you're not. The idea that the minimum wage is inflationary in and of itself, remember I said that only a few percent of the population, but I'm going to do it a different way. You push up the minimum wage, you also push up the wages that are above it. And what you do is you improve the standards of living for a good chunk, not just that 2% who's receiving the minimum wage, but for the next 5 or maybe 8% who are just above that minimum wage, you push up their wages as well. It does raise the costs of good, but think about this. If I'm a grocery store right there and I'm a grocery store right there, or if I'm a cafe right there and I'm a cafe right there, and everybody's wages are going up by the same amount, your competitive position hasn't changed at all. Yes, you may have to charge a little bit more for the goods that you're selling, and we do have to then pay for goods. You know, if my ability to as a consumer to receive cheap goods involves exploiting workers, I'm not so happy with my goods that I'm buying. So I'm going to push back on the inflationary side and say that the benefits from raising the minimum wage with regard to improving the welfare and well-being of the bottom, let's say 20% of wage earners, those benefits are much greater than any other costs that might be imposed in society.
So accepting that, what has caused inflation over the years from 25 cents an hour or whatever, you know, what causes inflation then?
Oh, God, that's... No, well, yes, we had different kinds of inflations. We had that wage price inflation spiral of the 60s, 70s that had to be brought under control in the 80s. Through much of the 90s, we had very low inflation, and inflation wasn't an issue. Right now, the inflation that we're living with right now has to do with what happened to the economy, and we're bidding up a lot of durable goods as we get back into the economy. So the prices of things that are in scarce supply have gone up tremendously, and we have other kinds of things that are driving it up. So we're not in the inflation that we had back in the 70s and 80s when in 1983 I bought my first house at 12% interest. We're not there. Housing interests right now are still low in the 3-point-something%. It's not the same kind of inflation. We don't like it right now, but it's not the systematic well-being eroding inflation that we had back then.
Guaranteed universal minimum income is, our safety net is such a web of things. Would a minimum income be feasible, and would it be a substitute for a safety net?
Yeah, some sort of guaranteed minimum income for families in the United States. I think we've seen an experiment with that over the course of the pandemic. We know that the allowance of $600, or whatever the allowance was for children allowance, $600 and $250 for 5 and under and 5 and over. But that had a very, very positive effect on poverty. We also had the 3-time stimulus checks that went into households. So we have some evidence of how valuable that is to households. Do we have the political will, though, to just maintain the child tax credit as a regular payment to households with children, which we knew did tremendous amount of value to households, and then B, supplement that with another mandatory minimum to just help maintain the households more broadly? We can't even get to the child tax credit. Should we? I don't see any reason why we shouldn't think about it and try it. Can we, or is it feasible? I don't see a lot of political will to even go down that road right now. It's something that people like to talk about. It's something that people will talk about, this experiment or that experiment. But in terms of the politics involved to do that, not in this country, not at this time.
So has it ever been adopted as national policy?
No.
I've heard about the English dole. Is that the same?
No, well, the dole, no, that was not very much money. That was, yes, being poor in England was not a good place to be poor. You ended up in Australia. Herman.
Dave, thank you for an excellent presentation. You always do such a fine job with this. It happens perhaps not by coincidence, but I was looking at some of those same workforce numbers myself this last week. Looking back 2 years, December to December, in other words, going back to the month just before the pandemic hit, Iowa has lost, I think the figure was 85,000 jobs. The number of people classified as unemployed has gone up only by 8,800.
Yes.
So 90% of the loss of jobs has nothing to do with people on unemployment. It has everything to do with people who have left the workforce. So when the governor wants to beat up on people who are unemployed, she's missing 90% of the problem. But wait, then you add in the figure, you mentioned the unemployed, the percentage of people unemployed who are actually collecting. Third week in December, it was only about 25%, just under 25%. So she isn't missing 90% of the problem. She's missing 97.5% of the problem. And then she turns around and insults people, this language about, safety net becoming a hammock. That's calling people lazy. That's all she's doing.
Yeah, and, the reason this distresses me is because I've been studying Iowa's economy for a really long time, and one of the hallmarks of the Iowa economy is Iowans work hard. They work they work more jobs than average, more people per household, more jobs per household than the average. Iowans work hard. They're not lazy. And to imply that they are is just absolutely, it flies in the face. The worst of it is though these policies are not based on research. They're based on other kinds of things. They're based on sentiments that maybe get passed down from other state leaders who have attitudes about the unemployed. Research tells us that the newly unemployed, if you know your job is gone and done, the newly unemployed, they get out there, they hustle, and they find work relatively fast. The people who struggle to find work, and need the most assistance tend to be middle-aged men with low skills, not able to be retrained, and stuck in a community where they're not going to find another job comparable to what they had. Middle-aged women, in contrast, by God, they're retrainable like crazy. They'll take different kinds of jobs and take times of risks. So our unemployed people there are all kinds of different responses to the unemployed. And then some of them drop out because they just can't, it's not worth working anymore because what they used to do doesn't exist anymore. So that's my talk for the night. Thank you for coming.